how we assess students, how the leadership, the admin is supposed to engage with the IB school community. The program standards and practices is the same for all three. There's a couple nuances here and there, but generally it is the same program standards and practices for all three programs. So that continuum, I think, is a beautiful place for us to be, and that we all ideally are on the same page as we work with our teachers and our teachers work with their kids.
And I'd just like to add that one of our division goals this year, I think, is we're going to unpack the standards and practices with all of the schools, because they just released the new 2020 standards and practices, and so that's going to be big for us as we get ready to go through our evaluation process. So,
Carrie, can you give some examples of what some of those are? And Dan, I think you sort of hit on it, but could you give some examples of what some of the programs, particularly the practices, are that are expected by IB?
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, we have the slide on approaches to teaching and learning. I know that's, but go ahead.
Well, I don't want to jump ahead,
But
so.
no, that's okay. We don't have a specific slide about the program standards and practices, but they have shifted. So thank you. I keep forgetting. So the IB goes through its own reflection, and prior to this curriculum review, they have updated the program standards and practices. So they are now published and out, and they are expected to be in practice in schools in 2020, which is why our work this year is just unpacking them and trying to understand how what we're already doing that meets the standards and practices. Some are very similar to the old standards and practices, and some are quite a shift. And then next year in 2021, we'll look at really getting the practices into our practice. So they've shifted to 4 big themes: environment, learning, culture, and purpose. The previous ones were purpose, organization, and curriculum. Curriculum. So looking more at really focusing more on the learner. If you look at the program models, the learner is at the center of those models, and so the standards and practices, in my opinion anyway, reflect those more. It's really about how is the student learning, what are we doing to support their learning, how are we setting up the environment, what is the culture of the school that is creating the space for this learning for all learners. And then some of it continues to be about the governance and policies as well.
At the real practical level at the school, are the teachers involved in collaboration? Are they making common assessments? Are they informing their instruction with common assessments? Is it inquiry-based instruction? So the nuts and bolts of what happens in collaboration meetings and then engaging the students. That's the true standards and practices that impact, I think we're most interested in for that conversation.
Yeah. So this is an overview of the structure, and we set it up this way so you could see the similarities across the programs, and then you could see where they might vary slightly. So as you'll see, the primary years program and the middle years program are for all students. So up until 10th grade, all students are receiving or involved in the programs. You'll see that pre-K, the pre is in pink because we don't currently have the early years program for our preschoolers, but it is something that we're definitely looking into to bring to Thackeray. You'll see that conceptual framework go across from the PYP to the MYP, with the PYP being transdisciplinary and the middle years program being interdisciplinary. International mindedness all the way across, and then we have our end culminating projects. Diploma program stands out a little bit more because it's an optional pathway, and I know that Dan talked about how we make it for all a little bit earlier, and it's for our 11th and 12th grade students. There's a prescribed curriculum, and then they have the external assessments that they take. Did you want to talk about those at all?
Well, I think historically that's why we always thought it was just for elite, because the assessments are rigorous. If you look at the IB mission statement, rigorous assessments, I think, is in the second paragraph. But the assessments are approachable, I believe, by all students. Remember, it's not just being knowledgeable when we assess students. One thing I love about IB and what turned me on as a IB biology teacher and why I wanted to get more involved with the program was the fact that the assessments really look at a holistic learning process. It's not just being knowledgeable, but you'll see the learner profile come at play in how we assess students in an IB program. And some of our assessments are internal, which means they're done in the class, they're scored by IB rubrics, teachers score it, and then we send off a sample to be judged by IB examiners. What I make it clear to students and teachers alike, they're really not grading the kids at that point, they're grading our teachers to make sure that they're using the rubrics properly. And then, of course, we have external assessments which are sent out, all of the student sample is sent out to be scored by examiners.
One of the things that we talked about previously, Dan, was about 10 years ago, and it's a little bit apples to oranges here, but I think it's relevant from the perspective of governance and implementation of the IB program, and thinking about this idea of assessments in particular, was that the College Board did a study, and the College Board found that it was more important that a student accessed the most rigorous curriculum that there was to offer than that they got a good score on the final assessment. So for example, and College Board does all of the AP, and so that's why it's a little bit of apples and oranges here, but it is similar sort of in conceptual notion, is that students that took an AP course and got a 1 or a 2, which is not a passing score on an AP assessment, went to college and completed college at a higher rate than those students who had never taken an AP course before. And the reason and the rationale behind the study that they determined was that it was more important to experience the rigor of that course than it was necessarily to completely knock the content and out of the park and get a 4 or a 5 on the AP assessment. So if you think about it in the context of IB, I think many of us would argue that it's more important for a student to take an IB course and get a 1, 2, 3, or 4 on the assessment than to take the IB course and hold them to, you have to get a 6 or a 7 on the assessment for it to be considered a success. Mm-hmm. So that is a cultural piece that can oftentimes create, I don't want to say consternation, but it can create anxiety in the community that then ultimately can come back to the board, for example, saying, well, if you look at your IB scores are not very good because you're having these, you got more kids taking the course and taking the assessment, but your overall score is, you're averaging a 3.5 or a 4 or a 4.5. And our argument would be it's more important for the student to take the course, experience the rigor, than for us to average a really high score. So it's just something that I just throw out there as for consideration as we continue this conversation about IB for all, that if we want all of our kids to access the program, they're accessing the rigor, and that is more important perhaps than what they get on the test.
Absolutely.
And that's actually in the research.
Did you want to
We didn't talk about the culminating project.
Oh, yeah, let's make sure.
So at the end of each program, there are culminating projects, and in the primary years program, that is our exhibition. And this is a time for students to really choose a passion and an action project that culminates their time in the program. It's a time for them to synthesize everything that they've learned and put it into place. They research, they work in groups, and it's a real community experience. We had 72 community members, mentors for our kids last year, and that's incredible. We had representatives from all of our school buildings come over once a week to meet with students to help them, guide them along this process. We had parents, we had community members, we had people from the central office there for support. It's a celebration of their learning, and so we're just really grateful that we have a community around us that supports that as well. Alicia, did you want to talk about community and personal?
Yes, definitely. So we, last year, started a pilot with the community project that is typically done when an IBMYP program ends at grade 8 or grade 9. But as a full division school committed to IB, we are embracing the community project in addition to the personal project during the students' MYP journey. So last year we piloted the community project. We had 50 eighth graders take part in it, which came to about 24 projects, because the community project you're allowed to do as a group up to 3 students. And we have some pictures later so that we'll go into what that looked like and some of the outcomes from that. But similarly to exhibition, it's an opportunity for students to inquire into a need, particularly a need in the community. So the first thing they need to understand is the definition of this big concept of community. And they look at community. It can be as small as the classroom to as large as the world. And they identify a need in the community, and then they decide how they would like to take action for that need. And their action can be research. I just want to learn more about it. Public awareness. I want to bring awareness of this to my personal community, or taking action in terms of I'm going to actually go out and do something to help with the need. So this school year we will see all 8th graders participating in the 8th grade community project. And then the personal project is the culminating project for the IB MYP. And this is an independent inquiry that students take, where they make connections in this project to all of their learning from the MYP. They basically can inquire into anything they want. They can decide that they want to improve on something that they already do, they want to do it better, or they can do something totally new. So they set a challenging goal for them, for whatever it is that they're inquiring into, and go through a very similar process as the community project. They inquire, they investigate, they decide on how they're going to take action, and then they create a project to display their learning. The personal project is internally assessed and also externally moderated in the same way. It's more of an assessment of how teachers looked at the projects and the school, rather than really a comment on the kids and their projects as well. You want to talk about?
Yes, very quickly. So
Yeah.
the extended essay, you don't have to be an IB diploma student actually to engage with that. We actually have 1 or 2 students every year who select to do that, as long as the TOK course as well. The extended essay is up to a 4,000-word independent research paper. It is done outside the confines of any class. Ideally, the student should be working with a mentor along the way. Not that the mentor is holding their hand, but it is just someone to bounce off ideas and review outlines and the like. That essay is a requirement of an IB diploma. It's optional for other students. The TOK course also has an essay, which is a required essay. That is also scored by IB examiners. It's not as long, 1,600 words, and it's based on a prompt, one of which I actually will share with you momentarily, to show you how that conceptual-based knowledge is displayed in the prompt and how it's scored. But those are both essays that are due at the end of the diploma program. And if I actually start this slide, so the approaches to teaching and learning, if we look at, how are these programs, program standards and practices, it really centers on what's going on with teachers and kids and kids' learning outcomes. The approaches to learning, those are things that have to be explicitly taught, and the students, going back to those projects at the end of each program, that's where they get to showcase their research skills, their thinking skills, their communication skills, their self-management skills to get it done on time, knowing that they're done outside the confines of classes other than the TOK essay. So the skills have to be explicitly taught over the 3 programs, and the students get a chance to showcase them throughout the program. In terms of internal assessments, also diploma program, they showcase them actually throughout the program to terminate with the extended essay and TOK. And then, sorry.
Oh, okay. So when you look at the last slide at the bottom, connecting all of the programs. And when we go back to the, thank you. When we go back to the four pillars of an IB education, one of the four is to develop approaches to teaching and approaches to learning. So